as we anticipated before, we're now going to talk about the way in which you can solve and work with the sharecropping model. So first of all, we start from, I left you with the equation on the slides. So we write down the maximization program first, maximizing the utility function of the principal, landlord now, Q upper bar minus T upper bar, plus 1 minus pi 1 Q lower bar minus T lower bar. And we maximize this equation under the constraint that were identified before. So first of all, the incentive compatibility constraint, minus psi 1 minus pi naught T upper bar minus plus 1 minus pi naught T lower bar, incentive compatibility constraint. And then we have the participation constraint, which ensure the agent is actually accepting my contract, minus the cost of effort greater than the reservation utility. And then we add this time the limited liability constraint. Now, exactly as we did before, the technique is to construct the Lagrangian function L pi 1 Q upper bar minus T upper bar 1 minus pi 1 Q lower bar minus T lower bar. And now we can add each constraint multiplied by the corresponding Lagrange multiplier. So pi 1 T upper bar plus 1 minus pi 1 T lower bar minus psi minus pi naught T upper bar minus 1 minus pi naught T lower bar plus mu1 times the participation constraint plus mu2 times the limited liability constraint. Exactly as we did before, we can now partially derive the Lagrangian function with respect to T upper bar and with respect to T lower bar. And what we will get? We will get pi 1 plus lambda pi 1 minus pi naught here and there, plus mu1 pi 1 equal to 0. And we do exactly the same for T lower bar. And we get minus 1 minus pi 1 minus lambda pi 1 minus pi naught that we will then call delta pi, plus mu1 1 minus pi 1 plus mu2 this time equal to 0. Now, as you can see, we have now, compared to before, 3 constraints and 2 and 3 Lagrange multipliers. But our unknown are only 2. Still T upper bar and T lower bar. Okay, up here. What does that mean? It means that one of the constraints that we are including in our maximization is actually redundant. So we don't need to use it in order to find the solution. Which one is of the 3? This is what we need to find out. This is what we need to discover. And how do we do that? Checking the value of the corresponding multiplier. Remember that a lambda or a multiplier strictly positive imply a binding constraint. Okay, so in this case, it's actually quite easy to check before we go and verify the value of the multiplier, which one is the constraint redundant, and how we can check that. Let's have a look to the introduction of the limited liability constraint. Let's assume that T lower bar is actually equal to 0, so that the limited liability constraint is binding. In this case, when we look at the incentive compatibility constraint, we can see that this part will actually disappear. And because pi naught T is actually positive in order to induce incentives, we know that pi naught T times psi will be actually greater than psi only, given that this part will actually be positive. So if it's true that the left-hand side is actually minus psi is actually greater than 0, it will be even more so and even more binding if is greater than a quantity, which is actually positive. So if the limited liability constraint is binding, the participation constraint becomes redundant. And in this case, we don't need to use it to find the solution. Why? Because the solution for T lower bar will be provided by the limited liability constraint. So we will have one equation, the incentive compatibility constraint, that we will use if binding to find out the value of T upper bar. And another equation already known that is actually solved with inequality. So T lower bar is equal to 0, which is provided by the limited liability constraint. So if this is true, if this is the case, we go now and see the value of the two multipliers when we use the first order condition. So if we assume that the limited liability, that the participation constraint is actually redundant, the corresponding multiplier will be equal to 0, because if the constraint is not binding, it means that it will be the multiplier equal to 0. So from this one, we obtain that lambda delta pi is equal to pi 1 is equal to pi 1, which means that lambda is equal to pi 1 divided by delta pi. These are all elements greater than 0. So this confirms our idea that lambda is strictly positive, which implies ICC binding. Let's go and have a look now what happened for the second first order condition. From the second first order condition, we get that μ2 is equal to 1 minus pi 1 plus lambda delta pi. And therefore, knowing that lambda is strictly positive, that will be also strictly greater than 0. So we know now that is true, our assumption is verified, that the limited liability constraint is actually binding, solved with inequality. So from this, we obtain that the optimal contract that the landlord should offer, in this case to the tenant, is going to be given by T lower bar equal to 0, and as a T, and we go and introduce this in the incentive compatibility constraint, and what do we get? We get pi 1 times T upper bar minus pi naught t upper bar equal to psi, and therefore we get that t upper bar is equal to psi divided by delta pi. What can we say about this two optimal contract? According to the sharecropping contract, an optimal contract that the tenant would be likely to accept is given by a reward schedule where, in case of very bad outcome, Q lower bar, the tenant should not reward, should not pay back the landlord in any possible way. Zero. It doesn't get anything, but it doesn't pay back anything. In case of Q upper bar instead, the transfer, the reward schedule that it should get is actually proportional to the level of disutility that is going to that it has had. So the higher is the disutility, the higher will be tau, and also inversely related to how much effort that he has obtained, that he has exerted. So this is what this reward schedule would say. Now, if we substitute back these contracts, if we substitute back these contracts, this payoff in the utility function of the landlord, what do we get? We get P1 equal to pi 1 Q upper bar minus T upper bar plus 1 minus pi 1 times Q lower bar minus T lower bar. And what do we have here? We have that T lower bar is actually equal to 0. So we can rewrite that as P1 times Q upper bar plus 1 minus P1 Q lower bar minus pi 1 psi divided by delta pi. As you can see, this one represents the gain that, in terms of outcome, that the landlord will obtain when the tenants exert the high level of effort. And this one represents the cost of inducing effort, the cost of inducing the high level of effort. What will be the expected utility instead of the tenant? The expected utility of the tenant will be given by pi 1 T upper bar plus 1 minus pi 1 T lower bar minus psi, which is given by pi 1 times psi divided by delta pi minus psi, which is equal to pi 1 minus pi 1 plus pi naught delta pi, everything multiplied times psi, which eventually will leave us with. What does this represent? This represents the expected rent that the limited liability constraint provides the tenant with. As you can see, the expected utility when we substitute this payoff is actually positive and increasing in the level of this utility. What does that mean? It means that since the landlord introduced a clause in the contract of the limited liability constraint, which provides insurance to the tenant, it becomes more and more difficult for him to induce a high level of effort. Why? Because he has incentive not to do so. Because in the worst possible case scenario, he's not going to pay back anything. So this is something that I would like you to pay attention to. In these contracts, whenever you introduce the limited liability constraint, you are basically altering and changing incentive for people. In this case, what we are testimonying here, is the trade-off between incentive and insurance. The higher is the power of incentive that you would like the agents to exert, the tenants to exert, and the more you will have to pay for that. The only problem with this is that if the incentives that you are requiring as a landlord, as a principal, is too high, you might not accept the contract. On the other hand, if you provide as a principal, as a landlord, too much insurance, the tenant will not have any incentive to exert effort. So it's not easy for the principal, for the landlord, to find the right balance between incentives and insurance. Offering a contract that provides a lots of incentive to exert high effort and still get accepted, and offering a contract that provides a little bit of insurance to poor tenants, poor peasants, but on the same time that still would like to provide the high level of effort.